Hey, what's going on, guys? So I am going to be working on recreating, kind of using this as some inspiration from professional tabletop. I guess we'll call it a crater. It is 6x6. I'm taking them as inspiration, guys. If you want to just buy it straight from them, go ahead and buy it straight from them. But if you don't have the money and you've got some spare materials laying around, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take some of this poster board, cut it down to about 6x6 inches squared. Then you're going to take about some 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch foam, cut it down to about 5x5. The reason we're cutting it down to 5x5 is we're going to cut a jigsaw pattern around the outside as well as the inside to create the walls of the crater. And then we are going to take that and attach it, and then we're going to decorate it up. Okay. So all I really did is I came in with a hot wire foam cutter at about a 45-degree angle, cut out a big squiggle, removed it, flipped it in, came in from the opposite 45 angle, and kind of traced the lines out a bit, which is how we end up with this removable internal chunk, which gives us this nice big deep crater wall. This should be large enough to put 3 or 4 32mm figures in it, so this is also really great for D&D. If you need the crater to be shorter than this so that a vehicle can sit on top of it, just use thinner foam, or even cut this in half if you have a hot wire foam cutter. If you need to do this with a knife, you won't be able to get as jagged a lines and as smooth a lines as this, but you can definitely still get the same effect. On other things that I've done here on the channel, as well as on other things I've done on social media, I've used a knife, and it's hard to tell when all is said and done whether you've used a hot wire foam cutter or a knife or not. We're just going to remove the internal cuts, and we're going to save those for now because we're going to be able to use those for a project soon in the future. So next we're just going to take some good old-fashioned Mod Podge. I got mine from Hobby Lobby, and I added some black paint to it, and we are going to black bomb the foam to protect it against spray paint. And then we're going to add our sand and grit, and you want to use a relatively cheap brush for this sort of stuff. It can get a little nasty when you use your decent brushes, so either go get some of these nice foam disposable ones, or just use an older brush that you don't particularly care about. Now the trick to this stuff is once you start applying it, to just keep moving it around. You don't want to goop too much up in one spot, and you just want a nice even coverage, and then you're going to need to leave this to dry before we start to spray paint it. You don't want the moisture in this paint, quote unquote, this Mod Podge paint, to interfere with the painting process later when we start to use spray paints. Okay, so now that this is all dry, we're going to be applying grit. Now you could use super glue, but to keep things simple, I am just going to go ahead and I am going to use PVA glue, which is a water-based glue, and we're just going to go ahead and we're going to cover the bulk of this. It's not important if we get every last bit, but we want to get most of it, and we're going to cover this in PVA glue to then add all of our 4 different types of grit you see in front of us. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing to both of these pieces, but it's fine if you want to keep it thin on the walls. As you can see, I've got this a little wet from when we cleaned the brush earlier, which is absolutely fine. And we just want to give a generous, healthy coating of PVA glue across the entire surface. And again, like I said, on the walls of this crater, we want to kind of keep the glue on a little thin. We don't want large rocks sticking to the surface of the crater walls, but we can definitely have larger rocks sitting in the basin down here. That's fine. But we want the lightweight grit, any of the sand-like material, to stick to the walls, and we want all the nice thicker rocks to stay in the bottom and along the outside. And this process is going to be a little messy, which is why I'm doing this on top of my cutting mat, so I can kind of clean this up and reuse a lot of the grit later. But we are just going to sprinkle the grit along the edges of the crater walls. And we're not looking for 100% coverage. That's fine if you miss some spots. It's not the end of the world. But we're just going to kind of do this pinching motion, which really allows us to get a nice variety in the spread of the grit along the surface of everything that we're doing. And we're going to take some of our larger stuff and just kind of, again, sprinkle it around the area. Make sure it gets into the glue and sticks fast. Take some of the smaller rocks that we have, maybe push them into the corner a bit, sprinkle up some more of the grit around those rocks so they kind of blend in a bit better, and we'll add some watered down PVA on top of them to help them lock in place and make sure these nice big piles of grit stay where they're supposed to. And it's okay if you want to put some piles of grit on some of these open flat areas. You want to try to leave the center of the crater at its lowest spot. So if you want to go in and add some more of this grit around the outside edge to kind of make more of a bowl-like shape, you definitely can. And then we're going to come in with some more of our sand and baking soda mixture and try to hit all the areas that we missed the first time around. Now, normally you don't want to use baking soda just because it yellows over time, but because we're going to be painting on top of this, it's not a big deal. And I have to hold the camera so you can kind of see this back edge a little bit better. And as you can see, the sand and the baking soda stick to the walls of the crater much better than the other grit does. And again, we're going to hit this with some watered down PVA once this starts to dry and set up. Alright, so how do we go from this, which isn't horrible, this is a good proof of concept, although I wouldn't go bigger than this because as you can see we're starting to get some bowing. So how do we go from this to this? Okay, there's a couple little tips and tricks that we can do here. There are no washes involved with this stage. Because we started with such a dark color and the colors that we use are going to be built up in a specific way, it makes it so that we don't need to use washes. Now you can use a black or a brown wash if you want to at any point in time during the color buildup phase, as long as you're still working with the neutral mid-grain tones. Once we move into the brighter colors, like the dark, going from the dark gray to the bright gray, you don't want to start applying washes beyond that point. However, because we've not talked about how to make washes or different techniques on using washes, we're not even going to bother using those in this video. So, where do we begin? So, we want to do a heavy overbrushing of gray on everything. This is going to start to knock the color down. Now, I have a granite gray and I have a slate gray, which is slightly darker. I'm going to be using the slate gray. And this is just apple barrel generic paint. It's nothing expensive. You don't need anything crazy expensive when you're working with terrain. Don't bother using your good hobby paints though for this. And basically what we're just going to do is we're going to kind of mush it into the bristles, get not all of it off, but a good chunk of it off. And then just real heavily, almost ham-fisted, we're just kind of going to go to town there and just bring this color in. And you go back to the palette as many times as you need to and try to blend in any harsh lines. Like right there we have a harsh line. Try and blend that in so that those harsh lines go away. But even in these nooks and crannies, we're not trying to avoid the recesses yet at this point. We're still going to be applying paint into the recesses. We're not painting the model though, we're still doing a dry brush style technique. You can still see plenty of that blue-black down in there. And we're just gonna keep working with this until we get it to the next stage. I'm gonna go ahead and do a jump cut here so you guys can jump straight to the point where all of this gray work is done, so you can see just how heavy I go with it. Okay, so let's say you make a little mistake here and you apply too much pigment. Go in and load up your brush, barely wipe any of it off, and start to work the color out around it so that that side just is a little bit brighter all the way around. And then we can save it with the next few layers that we build up, as opposed to worrying about it now and trying to fix it as a problem that has occurred now. We can fix it later. So at this point, brush is still wet, surface is technically still wet. Where do we go from here? Now that we've built up these gray and dark gray blue undertones on the model, or on the piece, we can start laying in the dirt tones. So I've got this acrylic brown here, and this is a just labeled as a generic brown. And we're gonna take, this is one of the darker colors I have, and we're gonna take this burnt terry, which is also labeled as an earth brown, and we're going to use these two colors. So the earth brown is going to get used for the ground and the inside of the crater, and the darker brown is going to get used for the upturned dirt. The idea is that it is blasted dirt that was underground that didn't have time to dry out from the sun, and so you have this wet exposed dirt that has created the lip of your crater here. So the crater needs to be just a little bit darker than the earth around it. It's one of those subtle things that your brain doesn't naturally pick up on, but the eye does, and it makes a huge difference. So the trick with this is to go ahead and get your brush wet with water or isopro or whatever you're using to clean your brush. Just get your brush wet. As you can see, my brush is wet, but it's not dripping wet. And we're just going to go ahead and on our palette here, we're going to kind of get this soupy brown texture. And we're just going to kind of stipple it in all around the flat areas. We're just going to keep working this in all around. If your brush starts to dry out, go ahead and get it wet again. It's not the end of the world. We can cover up some of these rocks now. It's not a big deal. We're going to be highlighting those here in just a moment, so it's not the end of the world. Now you could put a dot of slightly darker earth right in the middle of the crater with our next brown stipple that we need to add. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go back in with the darker brown, like I said. Now my paint's a bit older and it's starting to kind of goop up, and for terrain like this it's a really good use for this old paint, but just try to make sure that the goopiness doesn't end up on the model or it's going to ruin all your hard work. If you need to water it down a little bit to kind of get any of the super clumpy bits of the paint out, go ahead and do that. But yeah, we're just going to stipple this on just like last time. You can see, although this looks a little bit brighter, I promise when it dries darker. Because this is so sharp, I'm going to paint it a bit more solid in a bit to look a bit more like a large chunk of stone has been blasted out of the ground. But for now, we're just going to cover it up with our normal stippling process like everything else, just so that we don't have to make more work for ourselves to try to go around and work around later. But mostly we're trying to conceal the black layer so that there's very little of it left. So what little of it is left acts like a natural shadow. I wanted to show you guys how the colors really start to blend and start to look super earthy. We've got about 3 different colors on here right now, but it looks like there's so much more going on, and it looks like there's dirt flock and a lot of other like more expensive materials. And this is a really good way to just use cheap acrylic house paints stuff that's meant for normal hobby stuff. Heck, you could even use kids paints as long as it's acrylic to get this same texture and this same look. And again, we're just doing really simple dry brush technique. This is something that a lot of beginners are taught really early on in the hobby. So if you guys are new to this and dry brushing still seems a little scary, don't worry about it. It's something that will eventually come naturally to you, and it's definitely one of my favorite tools in the hobby belt to just be able to whip out this dry brushing technique and really start making things come to life. Now I am going to go a little bit brighter with this. I'm still working with that gray I had before, but I am just going to add a few drops of straight white paint into the gray and make it just like this super bright concrete stone color. So we're just going to kind of come in, and in a few places we're just going to brighten it up. And one of the last highlights we're going to hit it with is a desert tan color, like a khaki. And that's really to just kind of bring some color back into this piece. So again, real simple dry brush technique, but we are going to go really light this time because this color is very bright and vibrant compared to what we've been using, and a little bit goes a long way. You can already see it on some of the ridges here, just how much color this is bringing back into the diorama piece already. Or even in my case, just this terrain piece. It really brings a lot of life to what we're doing here. Our next step is going to be to do one very last bright gray highlight, and this is almost white, and I am going to just barely be mixing anything in on my palette here, and this is for extreme highlights. So we're basically going about 3 parts white to 1 part gray. This is an extremely bright highlight by comparison to everything else we've been doing at this point. I'd almost call this like a dusting, like you would do with a snow effect, but this is just to pick out all the really big stones that are in this. Anything that might look like a chunk of rock, we'll go a little bit heavier on that to try to really sell that this is a giant upturned piece of rock. And then I will come in with a straight white on that one piece here, just to really accentuate that that is a rock and not anything else. We want to make sure that these bigger rocks definitely get hit with this highlight. And we should be all set to go in and start adding flock. Now at this point I would highly recommend that you put some kind of sealant coat on this. You can definitely pick up something from Testers, which is what I typically use, or Army Painter, which is also excellent. I highly recommend that you just go ahead and get something that's meant for hobbies, as long as you're not doing a huge piece. If you're doing a huge piece, then go ahead and go with the Krylon, but just shake the ever-living crap out of that can. But yeah, so for right now I'm going to go ahead and clean this brush up, and then I'm going to go ahead and put a sealant coat on top of this. Alright, so now we're on to flocking. I highly recommend that you go with an Elmer's all-purpose wood glue. This is, or a white glue at the very least. Wood glue and white glue both work just fine. I really would prefer you guys to use this if you're not working in a well-ventilated area. Because I'm working in a well-ventilated area, and because of the chemicals that I am used to working with, I will be using Loctite just simply to get the job done. I've used it on a lot of my other terrain, and it really locks down the tufts and stuff. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to crack right in with some super glue. I'm going to show you one corner, and then we are going to cut until I've got them all done. But I'm just going to show you how to do one corner. You want to lightly apply it around the area you want it. In this case, because we're using squares instead of circles, because this is being used on a grid, I'm just going to be applying the grass around the outside. You wouldn't want to get it too close to the wall of the crater. You kind of want to leave a space as though the dirt that's been flung out of the crater has landed on the grass and has tamped everything down. And so you just kind of want to make kind of like this triangle shape. You want to take a little bit of the flocking material, and this is just a generic foam flock. This has no static grass in it. This is a mixture of my own design, and I will put a recipe out eventually for it. And then we want to take a little bit, not a lot, just a little bit of the static grass and add it to the top. mostly in the corner, but you do want to just add that in there, and that will give it a bit more realism. And then if you're using super glue like me and you have an accelerant, you can just spray that with the accelerant and that will lock down immediately, and then you can just move on to the rest. Again, we'll be back when I'm done with this and I will show you how to lock everything down if you're just using PVA glue. Okay guys, so I just have this in a dropper bottle. We are going to just kind of wet the surface of this with some Isopro. And then I have my watered down glue in this spritz bottle to make things a little easier. And it doesn't come out so great, but it works well for me on large areas. And we're just going to kind of apply this watered down PVA to the static grass. We're going to take a bit of a paper towel. We're going to lightly damp or tap down on the static grass to suck up all the extra. And then once that dries, it will be as hard as a rock. Guaranteed you will be able to play on this thing for a long time before you'll have to replace it. So I'm going to go ahead and do this on both pieces, and we will cut back when everything's dry and ready for presentation. Alright guys, and here you have the final product. As you can probably hear, just depending on if I decide to do a voiceover for this last part, you can hear that's pretty on there solid. This stuff is not really going to come off. You can see like 2, maybe 3 pieces, and that was just stuff that wasn't really attached to begin with. It doesn't really change the overall look. You can still see the difference between where the coarser foam and where the static grass is. But yeah, so these techniques can all be applied to create bigger pieces. And if you'd like a tutorial on how to do something bigger, so we have a slightly larger piece here following the same techniques it took to make the crater, but this is out of foam core for both the base and the walls and these little ruin bits. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial on how to make these craters. They were a lot of fun to make, they were super easy to do, and I'll see you guys in the next one.